Thank you very much. That was the first challenge, getting the cue while not wearing headphones. Okay, hi, welcome. And today with me on the panel, there will be Jillian York and Alexa O'Brien. So I'd like to introduce you while you are here already. Please come to the stage and welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining me. You all have, okay, everyone has a headphone. I wait for Jillian to put hers on and introduce Alexa while we're at it. Alexa O'Brien, she was on stage #1 already, so many of you might have seen her already. She's a journalist, an independent national security investigative journalist and also filmmaker. And since 2012, she has provided an extensive archive of the only available transcripts of WikiLeaks source Bradley Manning, closed trial, or the pre-trial. We really have an issue here. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused because when she says something and she doesn't have the microphone, I have a hard time understanding it. We'll figure it out, okay? So be a little patient. This is a first for me as well. Her work has been published in the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, The Guardian, Salon, The Daily Beast, and she has also been featured on BBC, PBS Frontline, On the Media and Public Radio International. And for her outstanding work, she was shortlisted for the 2013 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism in the United Kingdom. So please, a warm welcome to Alexa. I'm really happy to have her here. And also we have Jillian York. She's the Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And her work is at the intersection of technology and policy, which is why she's here today. With the focus on the Arab world, we're not so much focusing on the Arab world today, but certainly on freedom of expression. And she's a frequent public speaker. She's been here at Republica several times and has written for a variety of publications, including the New York Times, Al Jazeera, Atlantic, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and CNN. Okay, welcome to you as well. And now I put down my notes and I'll give you a very brief introduction in why we're doing this here. We have a situation where more and more communication and especially public debate is not just featured, it's channeled through the platforms of private companies. I'm talking, of course, about Facebook, about Twitter, about Google, YouTube, all these entities. And we have a situation where people in these companies have to decide what they would like to put on their platforms and what not. And the question, of course, is that in a situation like that, who's to decide? Who's to decide what is protected speech, what can be censored, what can be kept off the internet, what has to be published on the internet. And in my opinion, this is a very difficult question to solve because on one hand, you would probably agree that mostly private companies have the right to have terms and conditions for the use of their platforms, and if someone agrees to use them or abide by them and use the platform and the services, then that's a legal contract. Okay, so you're bound by a legal contract. At the same time, we have a situation where, as I already said, Facebook has allegedly 1.3 billion users worldwide. Now, is that a public forum? I guess so. But if you look at this as a public forum and as a private company at the same time, what about free speech issues? What about free speech protection by law? By constitutions in many countries, free speech is protected. At the same time as a lawyer or a executive with one of these companies, you can always say, we don't have anything to do with that, we make our own rules. Now, they do make their own rules, and the way they make their own rules is pretty intransparent. The rules themselves are transparent in the way that they are posted on the web. You know, you can look at the community standards, you can look at Facebook's community standards, you can look at Google's terms and services, and so on and so forth. But the way they really come into being, the people who decide about these rules are in these companies, they are employed by these companies, and they make the decisions. And at least I myself see a problem with that situation. I do see, on the other hand, a pretty big problem of government interference with this kind of speech that is being posted on these websites. You've heard or you're aware of a lot of examples of content being either blocked or taken down by the companies, not, for example, by governments in these countries. You've heard that YouTube was blocked for 2 years in Turkey, but you've also heard about the fact that YouTube in some countries itself as a company blocked access to videos that they deemed to be offending to, for example, Muslims. We'll talk about that case a little later on. But the question, of course, is a hard one: how to go about this, how to deal with these issues. And I'd also like to tell you that, of course, we invited Facebook to this session. And as usual, Facebook said, there's no one there who has time, right? The good thing was, I hadn't given them any slot yet. And Sandra from Republica said, you can do it at any time you'd like. So I answered to them and said, okay, give me anyone from public relations or your policy department on one of the 3 days of Republica, the most important social media conference in Europe, where there'll be probably 6,000 people attending. And they said, oh, sorry, we can't. So we would have liked to discuss this with them here, but since they're not here, or if there is someone here, please join us on the stage, right? But since there is no one here joining us on the stage, we'll just discuss it without them. Okay, and what was interesting was that in the little talk we had before coming on stage, I said, you know, I wanted to do this talk because I really think we have a hard question here to answer. And Jillian said, no, we don't. And that's why I'd like to first ask Jillian, why you think we don't have a hard question to solve here, please.
Okay, so in 2011, I gave my first talk at Republica, and that talk was called Policing Content in the Quasi-Public Sphere. And in that talk, I argued that these companies, with 1 billion users in some cases, more in other cases, are, at this point, making up what we would think of as the public sphere, except they're not. They're private companies. So let me just give you a couple of examples of the types of things that Facebook does not allow you to say. So first, we were just looking beforehand and realized that if you are a registered sex offender, you cannot use Facebook, period. If you, let's see, threats of self-harm, drug abuse, eating disorders. They do not tolerate bullying or harassment. They do not tolerate hate speech, but they don't define what hate speech is, of course, because they never do. And so on and so forth. Pornographic content, explicitly sexual content, et cetera, et cetera. However, now, after much protest, they aspire to respect people's right to share content of personal importance, whether those are photos of a sculpture like Michelangelo's David or family photos of a child breastfeeding. So they've loosened up a little bit on some things that have gotten a lot of media attention, but by and large, they still reserve the right to censor. And this is where I get frustrated, is on the topic of censorship, because I agree, I do think that in some ways this is a difficult problem to solve, but the real problem that I have is that because these are private companies, everyone always comes up to me after my talks and says, that's not censorship. Censorship is only when a government's involved. And frankly, that's bullshit. So, I think that when we talk about, it's quite distracting. When we talk about Facebook or Google, there are a couple things that we need to keep in mind. Number one, these are American companies, and they are going far beyond what we have in the US, the First Amendment, which regulates speech. They're going far beyond that and censoring whatever they feel like on a whim. So think about that. The second thing is that while they do have certain responsibilities in other countries where they have offices, so if Facebook or Google has an office in Germany, has an office in Turkey, they're legally obliged to abide by local law in that jurisdiction. They've got a choice. They can either abide by law or get out of the country. I understand that, of course, but a lot of times these companies are also censoring in countries where they have no offices and where they've had no request from that government. And we'll get into those examples later. I don't want to take up too much time right now, but I just want to illustrate the problem as not something that is just a matter of government requests to companies and companies responding to those legal requests. This goes far beyond that. You've got companies responding to the State Department requesting them to censor something in another country. You've got companies censoring at their own will, and so I don't think that that's a hard problem to solve. I think that these companies need to respect the principles of freedom of expression and pull back these terms of service that ultimately result in censorship.
That cheering is for you right now.
Yeah, I just wish we had a very boring talk next to ours. Go ahead. Would you like to immediately comment on that, or okay? So yes, this is Jillian asks if David Hasselhoff is back again. Okay, yeah, let's hope they are done after half an hour. Okay, anyway. Now, one of the interesting questions, though, looking at this from an international perspective, and that's, of course, is already a question for you again, Jillian, but of course for Alexa as well, is that we have different standards of freedom of expression. Now, how to deal with that? I mean, you're all aware of the situation that, for example, we as a German society, and I'm really using that in an emphatic way right now, we decided, through deliberate democracy and so on and so forth, of course, but we sort of decided that we would not tolerate, or we don't tolerate hate speech here on Jews, and the Holocaust denial, and all of these things are illegal. Now, I could argue that, well, that's the decision of our society to take. Now we have an international character of the internet. All of a sudden, we have competing notions of what freedom of expression entails. Now, you work under conditions where you say, freedom of expression is suppressed in many instances by different entities, governments, not just in the US, but also in other countries. But do you feel any sympathy with that? Or would you just say, no, we have freedom of expression that's defined by the First Amendment, let's say, and that should be the norm or the rule for the entire world?
I'm going to speak about my personal politics here.
Yes, please.
I mean, I think that I was having this discussion last week with somebody. They were talking about universal principles. And I said, so you completely agree with blowing up 3,000-year-old Buddhist statues or, protecting that? I'm not a moral relativist. I do believe in the freedom of expression. And of course, that can be offensive in certain cultures. There are taboos. There are ethoses within every culture. I wanted to just simply add, in addition to censorship, there's the idea of chilled speech that also is a part of this. And when you have Facebook or other internet service providers turning over information to the Department of Justice, to the FBI, to the NSA, and you have also even the appearance of that happening, you see that happening to other people, that also has an effect on speech as well, because people become afraid to actually speak out. Or when the issues of freedom of speech come up, for instance, like they did last year in the United States, where the patriarch of Duck Dynasty, talked about his religion and his views on gay people, and it was offensive. You can also see this issue being used by entrenched political factions to really not deal with it. What I mean to say is that the discussion becomes so bipolar that it doesn't recognize in the world that there are many forms of expression. It's not just simply the dominant bipolar political factions. So when we talk about expression in the First Amendment, we have to really look at it in terms of what's natural human behavior, not simply what's ideologically the norm.
Okay, I'll pass on the mic to you, because that question is also, of course, asking you for your opinion on the international issue here.
Sure. So, I mean, I think I largely agree, and I'm going to bring my personal politics into this as well and say that, I come at the idea of speech from a purely internationalist perspective. I think that right now, the conversations that we're having, and I go to a lot of these internet governance conferences where people are discussing this really in terms of cultural relativism, in terms of this nation does this nation does this, but we've all got this sort of baseline of what we agree is free speech. And I've got a real problem with that, because I think that we are dealing with an epoch where I'm interacting with people from Germany, from Bahrain, from Syria, from every day. And I think it's unreasonable at this point in time to continue to think about speech in the sense of national borders. I just don't think that that's a realistic approach. And so I think that it's time to start rethinking this from an internationalist perspective, but also to think about the idea that I think actually the example that you gave was a perfect one, because in that case, the Duck Dynasty example that she talked about, what you had as a result was not the state coming in and telling this person they could not be on television. It wasn't even particularly the television network that did it. It was public pressure. It was public response to what people perceived to be hate speech. And we don't have a law in the US that forbids that, but rather you've got the principle of more speech is the best response to speech that you don't like. And I firmly agree with that. And so you can talk about, on the one hand, the German people making a decision through a deliberative democratic process to ban this kind of speech, or on the other hand, you can talk about when someone says something distasteful or hateful, you've got the sort of mob mentality to go after that person and say, enough, we don't want this anymore. And I think that both approaches are ultimately democratic, but I do really question the idea of wanting the state to regulate this.
No, yes, of course.
My sense with this is that this always becomes a question of prohibition. You know, where is the line? To allow as much expression. So if we're going to prohibit speech, what is the speech that's going to be prohibited? I would default to that.
But there is prohibited speech in the United States as well. You know, it's not that you don't have prohibited speech. We have it in Germany. You know, it's probably there all over the world. We have different standards for that. And one of the major questions is not just where to draw the line between prohibited speech and not prohibited speech, but who draws the line. Now, usually when we're talking about a public space, we say that, and freedom of the press and freedom of expression, we look to the judicial system. We say we have some laws here on our books, and these need to be interpreted. And there's a history of interpretation, and it should be done by specialists and so on and so forth. And what is being done now is that the idea of where to draw the line, or the question of where to draw the line, is answered by people at private companies, right? So at the same time, Jillian, you just said, I don't want to see government interference there. But isn't it necessary for the government to interfere in a way to say we need to regulate that forum in the sense of a public space? Isn't that where the government interference then is again required?
So, touche. You know, it's a difficult question, and my organization does not come down on the side of regulating the companies. So we come down on the side that these companies do legally have the right to prohibit speech, but we don't believe that that is the right decision. And, you know, I do think that this is a question that I think about all the time, and that I'm not 100% sure what the right answer is. I'll be perfectly honest. I've gone from, you know, thinking that the government should step in because these social media platforms are ultimately serving as utilities at this point. And so I have had that perspective. I've also seen it from the other side. I'm not always entirely sure what the answer is there.
I think it's very hard to talk about these things also outside of context. Because there's always nuance to this. I think we should also bring up the issue of terms of service in terms of when it becomes a legal matter for somebody. I'll give you an example. The U.S. government in the Manning trial used the terms of service on the classified computer to actually build their case for the Espionage Act. And, you know, at one point, Manning had actually the government never produced a signed, basically, terms of service or agreement, basically user agreement with the system. And so Manning's lawyer essentially stood up in court one day and said, you know, the U.S. government could say you have to stand up and sing the, you know, U.S. national anthem, and if the person didn't do that, or if they did that, then they leaked classified material, then they would be a criminal. So I think there's also the issue of this is not just simply about cutting people's speech off. This is also about putting people in jail, people like Weave, who are the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is oftentimes established in court by prosecutors saying, for example, that the employee or the user broke the terms of service or violated the terms of service. So I think that this definitely needs to be looked at in a manner that's beyond just simply expression, that is in terms of the penalties that come from these kinds of things.
Yeah, I totally agree, certainly. Now, I think one more question here that we need to pose is, of course, if you agree to these, or if you have a monopolistic or oligopolistic structure of this kind of space, then do we need to have, again the question for regulation, sorry about it, but I think it's appropriate here. If we have that situation where you have a couple of networks that are spanning worldwide, that have hundreds of millions of users, do we need to ask the question of, do they have to be bounds to the terms of services that they can apply, that they can use for going about their business? Now, I think in every legislature there is such a thing, but it's pretty foggy because, you know, the freedom of private contract is pretty big, and you can't really dictate companies what they can bind their users to with their terms of service agreements, right? But what could be a tool to address this aspect? You know, I'm thinking, for example, about competition law or something like that, to address that aspect where you could argue that a company cannot just do whatever it wants to if it, for example, has like, I don't know, 30% of people on their platform in a specific country.
So, neither of us are lawyers. I'm not sure if you're a lawyer. No, so none of us are lawyers, so this is a tough question to answer. But I think that I just want to contextualize it a little bit and give some food for thought, even if I can't perfectly answer the question, which is to say that, so a lot of times when I have said these things in speeches before, I've given this talk so many times, and I've said that these companies, these platforms are censoring, and people say, well, you know, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, leave Facebook. And that's what I think we need to think about, because leaving Facebook is not so simple these days. You see, if you want to comment on, I don't know, for example, the New York Times, although I might be wrong about that one in particular, you have to be on Facebook. If you want to log into Spotify, you have to have Facebook. If you want to participate in the White House town hall on the internet, you have to have Facebook. You can't extract yourself from that public life so easily. It's not like that anymore. Sure, you can go to Google or you can go to X other platform that maybe we don't know about, but you won't have the same opportunities. And this is true for people in other countries as well, that when you look at some of the organizing that has happened on Facebook, as much as I hate to say it, there has been really important organizing on Facebook all over the world, and if you're excluded from that, you're excluded from the conversation entirely. So at that point, we are looking at these companies as monopolistic. At the same time, I think that that's a strong argument for competition and for distributed systems. And so I don't think that there's necessarily one answer to this. I'm not sure if it's entirely a legal answer or a combination of a legal answer and a development technical answer. But I do think that that's what we need to be taking into consideration. And I will tell you, I've had this conversation with Facebook, both in a public space and in private before. And as far as I can tell, they don't care.
I think this fundamentally comes down to also creating the architecture that has the solution. Fundamentally, that becomes adopted. I mean, obviously, there's a risk to that in the sense you could build something and no one will come and no one will adopt it. But the platform that is able to perhaps allow greater expression, or instead of having a statist view of regulation, having a community-based regulation. You know, if you have bullies, for example, having people who know how to deal with them, or being able to explain, social etiquette regarding, being a troll, or tolerating trolls, but perhaps having people who can come to the aid of somebody who's being attacked by a troll and explain, the mechanisms. So I think that there are other options other than creating another tyrant on top of, simply government regulation.
Right, but then again, if you look at the attempts to create competition to Facebook and other platforms, they haven't really been successful in the way that if you look at a certain model, like the Facebook model, there was something like Diaspora, no one really joined it, it didn't really take off. So it seems to be a problem that also, or it's not a problem, but we also have to look at the fact that people do like to use these platforms, right? I mean, this is entirely obvious. That's why they have so many million users. And they seem to be okay with what is going on there. So this is also something that we need to take into account here, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that we have to look at the fact of something else too, and I wasn't sure that I was going to say this, but I've decided that I feel like it. A lot of these companies have actually infiltrated our spaces and our networks. I am part of, I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and up until a few months ago, we were members of a platform called the Global Network Initiative, which was started in response to Yahoo. You might remember a case in 2005 where Yahoo handed over information to the Chinese government that resulted in the imprisonment of a Chinese activist who was just last year released. And after that happened, these companies, along with academics and NGOs, all decided to band together and form a multi-stakeholder organization that would hold the companies accountable to ensure that they did not make those same mistakes again. Great idea in theory, but what we've come to at this point is a point where Google is funding most of the NGOs that are part of this platform. They're funding the platform itself, and these companies are not being held accountable. Google is in our spaces, in the space that I work in, the so-called internet freedom or digital rights space. Google funds it. They're part of it. Facebook is getting into the game as well now. And I think that in that sense, these companies are doing the best that they can to be seen as champions of free expression, while at the same time insidiously censoring us on their platforms and responding to governments without transparency. Even if you look up until recently, I mean, I'm happy to say that the companies changed their opinions on this, but up until a few weeks ago, they were abiding by the NSA with the abiding by the U.S. government with secret letters, and they were not putting that information in their transparency reports. They've decided to go against that, which is great, with the national security letters, just came to me. They've decided to go against that and will now publish that information, but at this point, after all of that, I'm not sure that I can trust that they are publishing everything. I'm not sure that I believe them when they say that we support free expression, we're one of you. And I think that there's a lot of astroturfing going on from these corporations in Silicon Valley.
I think when it comes to platforms, too, we have to think about our assumptions or expectations. The issue of... No, it definitely wasn't. There's a power in a large platform that obviously the ISP can sell to advertisers or to whomever, they could data mine it. That's where they're getting their value. And there is also the idea that large platforms, like large broadcast networks, you can also distribute content. So when we're talking about political power and not just advertising, but a political message, there is a desire for minority groups or smaller groups to have access to those platforms to be able to distribute that message. But I think we also have to be realistic, too, that for me, I think the lowest expectation that we should have is that people who desire to communicate anonymously, who desire to communicate in a free way, are not prohibited from doing so by retribution from commercial providers and the government working in an extra legal fashion. I think that's really the lowest expectation that we should have, and that should be our benchmark. So for example, if we have a publishing platform like WikiLeaks that publishes classified material or otherwise censored material, and PayPal and Visa and Twitter and Amazon all decide whether it be based on business relationships, a gift economy, or actually direct requests by the government, there should be some kind of oversight over that, or some kind of benchmark of where one can appeal those things to. It should be essentially illegal to do that without some kind of due process mechanism. What we have now is very powerful factions taking over our communication channels, and the minority voice has no ability to actually produce, publish, or express themselves, and that's what's dangerous.
Okay, which brings me to one aspect directly. Thank you for that. That I wanted to touch on, and I put in that description of the panel that we are having here right now. And it's a little complicated to frame, so please bear with me here. When for example, in Germany, we had instances of news applications banned from the iTunes store because they depicted bare breasts of women, you know? So that is something that by our standards is completely okay, yeah, right? But by the iTunes store standards is not, right? So of course
disgusting.
There was, yeah, isn't it? So there was this huge outcry, of course. Huge outcry, but in terms of people debating that, it was quite a big deal in Germany. That of course publishers were pointing fingers at the networks, the channels of communication, and this is also what you're referring to. You know, we have these structures where content now is delivered through networks that are not the ones that they were used to be, right? You had a truck with newspapers in it, and you would bring it to the newsstands, and that was the channel. And now, for example, the iTunes store is the channel, or the Amazon store is the channel. And now we all of a sudden we have a situation where there is control from an entity that wasn't there before. So the publishers are, of course, crying foul there, but at the same time, they develop into huge media companies. I mean, they have developed into huge media companies over the last 40 years, of course, but still, they think. Not they think, but it's a given for them that they get to decide what voices they publish and what not to. And of course, they would completely deny that it has anything to do with censorship, right? This is not censorship. This is our editorial decision, what we publish and what we not publish. Now, you were personally in a situation where you put stuff on the web that was not published in the mainstream media because you thought it was necessary to do so. Now, is that something that bothers you, that you have these two different, apparently different entities that both claim that they are not bound by freedom of expression laws, but at the same time, of course, take the liberty to decide what to publish and what not to?
It does, absolutely. I mean, I should say, fundamentally, I'm a journalist. I'm not a technician, a technologist, but, I certainly believe in free software and free hardware. And the idea of proprietary software is very dangerous. I mean, you take Kindle, Amazon Kindle, and extrapolate it out, where, they can wipe a book from your Kindle that they regard as offensive, whether it's because it's obscene, because it's politically undesirable for entrenched factions. Jillian, actually, I want her to talk about, because this is relevant, about the censoring of political voices in the Middle East. Can you talk about that now? Because I think that's really...
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think that what you're asking here is a great example, and I think the line that you're trying to make is between publications. So let's say, the New York Times, for example, did not want to publish certain content from WikiLeaks, and therefore another platform was created, things were published elsewhere. Now, in that case, you have alternatives, right? I'm not excusing the New York Times, but I am trying to illustrate the point that I think it's a little bit different from some of these new digital gatekeepers, in the sense that if you don't like the New York Times, and I'm not a big fan myself, you can go elsewhere, you can print another publication, you can create another blog, you can create another newspaper. But if you can't get into the iTunes store, that's the only way that you can use something on an iPhone. Now, yes, of course, you can go to Android, but those are your only two choices, and they are both controlled by major media conglomerates. Now, when it comes to the Middle East, I think that this is where things get really interesting, because that example with the iTunes store censoring bare breasts, obviously I disagree with it, but it's also not political speech, and so it's an example that wouldn't have gotten people riled up as much in the US. I'm not saying it shouldn't, don't get me wrong, but then you look at, I'll give you an example of Facebook doing something very similar, although a little bit more extreme. There was a page actually I think iTunes also did this. There was a page on Facebook calling for a third intifada in Palestine. And if in case the history is not apparent, the first intifada in Palestine was largely nonviolent, the second one was violent. A third one could go either way, arguably. Now, the word literally means uprising. Remember that. Because Facebook had a page calling for a third intifada, they left it up, but then they got a threat from an Israeli law firm. $1 million lawsuit was threatened against them, and suddenly the page was gone. Now, Facebook publicly claimed that they found hate speech on the page. That was not transparent. I did not see that. in this case, it was actually interesting because it had sort of the Streisand effect, where when the page was shut down, 100 more cropped up in its place. iTunes did the same thing now. I'm just remembering this, that there was an app for the same purpose, and the app was actually, I believe it was a sort of a spin-off of the Facebook page, but was intended to provide news on Palestine from a number of different sources, and iTunes censored that as well. So in cases like that, you don't necessarily have the alternatives because you're not dealing with a country where there is a robust free press. In Palestine, you have just a few different papers. Yes, you do have a certain degree of freedom of speech that is not necessarily prevalent in other parts of the region, so it is a freer media space, but at the same time, you don't have all of those alternatives, and once something is censored in that way, there's not another store that you can go to. You don't have the same freedom of alternative that you might hear. And so it can be far more insidious when you think about it in these cultural contexts. And I think I'll end there. I'm sure we can raise other points.
I want you to talk about the material support for terrorism.
Okay. All right, so here's another great example. So on Twitter, about a year ago, there cropped up a couple of accounts by Boko Haram, the terrorist group in Somalia and Kenya. Now, the U.S. designates them as a designated terrorist organization. I assume that European countries do too. I'm not sure. Anyway, this was long before the attack on the mall in Kenya. And that was Al-Shabaab anyway. So there was this Twitter. I'm getting confused in my own head because I wasn't going to. Yeah. So on Twitter, there's this Twitter page, and it is tweeting in English. It's kind of humorous in some ways. It actually is tweeting at some point about cappuccinos, and all of a sudden a bunch of journalists are following it. So it becomes pretty well known because it's, we were joking at the time that it was, oh, don't worry about it, nobody's actually following this except a bunch of American journalists. But then something started to happen. Senator Lieberman in the US, who is the same person who called for Amazon to censor WikiLeaks, he started calling for the censorship of this particular account. And then others did as well. And for a while it didn't go down. And then one day it did. And it was really interesting because there was a Kenyan police chief who was actually very frustrated by this because he said that it was the only way that he was able to communicate with this particular group. Now, Twitter could have taken it down because it was against their terms of service, which do say that hate speech is prohibited just like the others do, although they tend not to be as censorious about it. But it also could have gone down because Twitter potentially risks running afoul of laws that prohibit material support to terrorists. This is something that Glenn Greenwald has talked a lot about over the years, and I can't do the topic justice, but essentially these laws mean that if you are to even remotely give the appearance of giving a platform to a designated terrorist organization, you could be prosecuted for supporting terrorism. And this has been used against people who were doing humanitarian things, for example, in Gaza, and were prosecuted.
1 second. I'd just like to know to let you know that I believe there have to be tons of questions. So after Alexa responds to this, I'll open this up to the floor and to your questions. So think about what you'd like to ask.
This issue of the support. Let's say the statute is material support for terrorism, but recently in the United States, as of 2012, it is actually legal to extradite or to imprison anyone in the world, including U.S. citizens, on the suspicion of terrorism without trial or charges. Obama says, you'll get a military trial, so don't worry. But this idea of material support is now expanded to substantial support. That's the language of the National Defense Authorization Act. And what's concerning about this is that in the run-up to Occupy, for example, myself and a group of other people organized 6 protests, and the government and private security contractors essentially said that we were infiltrated with cyber terrorists, that we were also infiltrated with low-level jihadists and tied to Al-Qaeda, Islamic fundamentalist movements. And this idea of substantial support becomes very, very dangerous, especially in light of what you've just said.
Okay, thank you. I'm thinking all the time about a great joke to crack, so to make you guys scream and at the others, but I can't come up with anything. Now, probably you can. The microphone is yours, so who has any questions or remarks? Please raise your hand. Okay, there's one in the last row.
So thank you, and I just want to bring up one example of Microsoft, who is also a sponsor of this event. Just recently, there was some leaking done by a Microsoft employee, and we learned that the company did look into their own Hotmail service to search for evidence on this topic. And so I think what we can see here is that those big companies basically employ what we call Staatsräson in Germany. So like, if they feel threatened, they employ basically all means possible to secure themselves. And so in this sense, I think we need to stop to just think about them as companies, but also with their size and the power they have, we have to talk about basic accountability. And we can't just let them get away with saying we are just a private company.
I agree with you. I mean, I think we also have to talk about like realistic political strategy. There are very powerful companies, and they are, especially Microsoft, which does basically the U.S. government's encryption. They are also in bed with the state, and so it really seems like the only possible hope that we have is when we're relying on the enlightened technician. I mean, we really are. We're at a very weird stage of our of history, where we're really relying on the enlightened technicians. It's almost like we're looking for the kung fu, the good kung fu, the kind that's going to create the kind of architecture that we can use that will allow us these freedoms.
But probably you'd like to comment on that as well. The question, of course, isn't that because the movement against these things, the protest and the criticism of these things is just too weak. I mean, we can complain about that, but at the same time, of course, we can exert pressure on governments. As citizens, we can. So there need to be other ways to find regulation and a way forward, except not just the idea that we need to. Trust in technology. I mean, you can trust the math. It's been okay.
It's not technology. It's the technologist. This is really about. It's a mixture of things. I mean, I think that there's certainly a political education or a learning curve that's taking place, even in the last 3 years with Manning and Snowden's leaks. I think. And the way in which we had revolutions through the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe, all of that was a very new thing, and I think we all learned from that. And the internet did become political. I think that here too, people of course must do anything that they can. If it means educating like Crypto Party or having this panel or people talking amongst themselves. But at the same time, I think for me, realistically, we also are relying on enlightened architects. And we're not the exception to history. Either people do this or else.
Okay, there's another question right there in the back. I can't really see, but you have the microphone, so we'll hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to hear your opinions about this Facebook as a public service. By which I mean, for example, I see Facebook doing kind of the same state capture that that banks have done in the U.S., where the banks redeemed too big to fail, and they reaped all the profits, and then they still keep on reaping the huge profits, but they never went down, and there was no prosecution. There was essentially nobody imprisoned or harmed, and especially because on Facebook we are the product, so we are the ones who are creating the content for ourselves in a certain sense, and I would be interested what you think about governments at least partially overtaking what Facebook is doing. Like, would it be a better world, or is it? I see you shaking your hands, but so what would be better? Better government regulation? That's again kind of weird, because you see that state laws don't really apply, as Facebook is overarching over all the states that we see, Europe and America.
Yeah, I have the feeling that both of you want to respond to that, right?
So I mean, I think that, like I said before, there are a couple ways that you can approach this. And I mean, I do think that there are intermediary approaches that would make sense in terms of government regulation. One of those would be to look at whether or not Facebook is essentially a monopoly at this point. Another would be to prohibit so I have to contextualize this with an example as well. You probably remember late 2012, there was a video called The Innocence of Muslims. It was created by an American Egyptian Coptic Christian, and he made this video to essentially incite. The entire purpose of this was incitement. And this video was decontextualized and shown on television in Egypt, which made it appear as though it had been a popular film in the United States. And unfortunately, people fell for that. At the same time, the video was put on YouTube, and although it was not spread over YouTube, it was available on YouTube. As a result, the State Department called YouTube and asked them to remove the video. Now, this was a period where the State Department, where U.S. embassies had been attacked in a couple of countries in the region. Tunisia is one of them. I'm not recalling what else. But State Department asks YouTube to take this video down, and YouTube says, well, no, but you know what we'll do? We'll take it down in Egypt and Libya. So YouTube makes a decision for what's best for the people of Libya and Egypt. Incredibly paternalistic decision, and then proceeds later to get more and more legal requests from other governments, responds to some of them but not others. So they took it down at the behest of the Russian government but not the Pakistani government. It was a very strange choice, and the whole time Google lied about it, for the record. And I know this because I have asked multiple different Google employees in public panels to talk about it, and they've all given different answers. So this is all on the record. The reason that I use this example is, should we ever be in a situation where a government can, through with no legal process whatsoever, call on a company to censor something, whether in that country or in another country? That, to me, is absurd. And so when I talked earlier about the Global Network Initiative, that's the thing that they're supposed to be doing. That's their job, and they're not doing it. And you've got organizations like Human Rights Watch in bed with them. It just makes no sense. And so I think that that's an intermediary step that we can take. We can try to find new ways, get the human rights organizations out of this like AstroTurf movement that's going on, get them out and try to put more regulation around that, around what the companies can and cannot respond to in that sense. But at the same time, I'm not sure that I trust the state to do a better job than the corporations. I don't trust either of them, and I think that that's why I said in the beginning that I don't have the answer to this yet. I've been working on this for 5-6 years, and I still don't have the right answer.
Let me ask a follow-up question, though, because you used that YouTube example. Another example is Twitter, who decided to block some tweets in some countries because they are against the law in these countries, in order to make the network or to protect the network from being blocked in these countries. Now, don't you see a good reason in doing that in these cases?
There's a short-term version of this. There's a short-term view and a long-term view. In the short term, Twitter deciding to take down tweets in France, for example, at the request of the French government. Now, this is very easy to circumvent, by the way. If you live in France, all you have to do is change your location to the United States or to another country, and you can see everything again. So Twitter's kind of smart about this, a little clever. And they did this because they have an office in France. They're legally obliged to do that or they risk being blocked. This has happened in other countries as well, including Turkey. I would say, if I were being pragmatic about it, that taking a short view, this is actually probably not a bad idea. But in the long view, if you want to think of this as the long game, if Twitter censors some tweets in Turkey, is that really what's best for the people in the long run? Is that really what people want? I mean, yes, this means that they get to keep their Twitter, but does it just insert more of this sort of very nefarious, insidious censorship into the culture, into what's acceptable? And will other companies then do the same thing? And so I think that, yes, I can be pragmatic about this and say that I think that Twitter did the right thing in the sense that in the short term, yes, they would be blocked, and that might be worse for the current protests and the current situation. But if we want to take a 10, 20, 30-year view of this, I think that we're just going to see more and more creeping censorship from corporations, and that's why we need to start thinking about this differently now.
Alexa, would you like to comment on the question that was asked about the regulation?
I mean, to me, I don't agree at all that the state should regulate this. I do believe, however, that there should be the judiciary should definitely rule towards the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that it has to be a technical violation and not a violation of terms of service. There has to be a technical breach. And there is uneven decisions within the I'm speaking specifically about my own country, within the U.S. District courts. And this is, of course, relevant to an international audience because the FBI allegedly can go anywhere in the globe and pick anybody up. So there's also the question of, since most of these companies that we're talking about in this particular panel are American companies, what is going on within the American judicial system is of import to the rest of the world.
Thank you. So there's another question here. Okay, Thorsten, please.
Are there countries where the freedom of speech has improved because the governments didn't want to block Twitter, didn't want to block Facebook?
That's a very hard thing to measure. It's a great question, and I think that it's worth taking into consideration. I mean, are there places where the presence of these platforms has enabled greater conversation and perhaps even revolution? Absolutely. I mean, I've talked a lot about Egypt over the past few years, and I've spent a lot of time there and talking with Egyptians and thinking this through. And in that case, Egypt already had freedom of expression online. Yes, they had a very restricted press in a number of ways, but they didn't censor any websites. You could get picked up if you were blogging in Arabic, but if you were blogging in English, you were probably okay. So there was a really interesting kind of situation there. And also in 2011, Egypt only had about 25% internet penetration, so a quarter of the country. So using Egypt as an example, I do think that Facebook or Twitter there enabled a degree of organizing that was not previously possible. You're talking about a country of 80 million people, and Cairo alone has, I don't even know, it's an incredible population, something 10 million, correct me, I have no idea. But you're talking about a situation where people were able to find other like-minded people much more easily and quickly than they would have been able to otherwise because of restrictions on gathering, restrictions on organizing. And so yes, I think that we can safely say that in some ways these platforms do help. At the same time, again, taking the long view, is it about Facebook or is it about a platform generically? And I think it's about a platform generically. And I wanted to say this earlier in terms of the too big to fail question. I actually think Google is a far bigger risk to us as a society than Facebook. Facebook is still a singular platform. Google has infrastructure. It's a much different question. But at the same time, in terms of Facebook, a decade ago, we were thinking that MySpace might never fail, and look where that's gone. So I think that, yes, platforms can enable greater speech, absolutely.
Is there another question? I can't see anything. No, apparently. Okay, there's one in the back. Okay. Last question, if I look at my watch and time is correct. Yeah.
Hi. You just said that Google could be or is a risk for society, considering all the new reports online last year. We could say that in some states or some parts of even Western states, like with surveillance and censorship, the states as well have let's say, could be a threat to society as well. The news organizations could be, the major ones have their own agenda as well. So I wonder, what do you think will happen in the next 5 or 10 years, considering that the people, they're all pretty upset, but nothing really happens?
Okay, I think we'll use that chance to include concluding remarks on that. Okay, if you have any.
I think that we are at a small opening of the door right now, and it could go any way. It could go towards a complete dystopian future. I really believe that. Or depending on how we treat Mannings and Snowdens and the whistleblowers that are sure to follow, whether or not we have the political courage to even sort of leave the panel for the panel and actually get out and do what we can do. I really believe that regardless of whatever happens, that each of us have the power to make the choice for ourselves. We have the will to do what we can do, what we know is right. And ultimately, it's going to depend on the political courage of people.
I obviously think that governments are a bigger threat to society than Google. However, I don't think that you can extract them from each other at this point. We know this. We know what the NSA has done. We know that Google and Facebook and these other corporations are essentially in bed with the NSA, and that they are trying to buy human rights activists off. And I mean that. I fundamentally mean that. I do feel as though, I absolutely agree with what you just said, that every one of us needs to take responsibility in this. Every one of us needs to start doing a lot more and speaking out. And I think that we need to, Microsoft is on the funders of this event. Do I think that that's incredibly problematic? Not really. I mean, not particularly for this event, to be honest. I don't see them, I don't see them doing the sorts of things here that I see Google doing at some of the other conferences that I go to in my space. But at the same time, should we talk about this? Should we be having conversations about this? Absolutely. And so I don't have all the answers on this. I mean, this is something that if I had all the answers, I would have written the book by now. But I do, challenge all of you to go out there after this and continue to raise these questions and think about, what we're handing over and what we're doing that's going to make or break progress in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Jillian. Thank you very much, Alexa. It was a tremendous panel, and we'll keep looking for those solutions. And thank you, everyone here in the room.